Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Hello, welcome back to Tadaima, everyone. I'm Erin Shigaki. I'm a Yonsei artist and activist in Seattle, Washington, on Duwamish land. And our programming is occurring during a moment of great uprising and reckoning in this country. And I just want to acknowledge that today is Juneteenth, the day in 1865, which marks the emancipation of Black slaves in the United States. I invite you to reflect on the fact that our work to tell the Japanese American incarceration story is inextricably tied to all liberation work in this country, first and foremost right now, that of our Black siblings. Without further ado, on behalf of the Minidoka Pilgrimage Planning Committee, I am pleased to welcome an ally to this Nikkei community, David Neiwert. David Neiwert is an investigative journalist and author based in Seattle. A fifth-generation Idahoan, he is a staff writer for Daily Cause and a contributor to the Southern Poverty Law Center. The most recent of his 8 books is Alt America, The Rise of the Radical Right in the Age of Trump, 2017. His book, And Hell Followed with Her, Crossing the Dark Side of the American Border, 2013, won the International Latino Book Award for General Nonfiction. He was awarded a National Press Club Award in 2000 for a series he produced for MSNBC on domestic terrorism. And of course, today we are here to talk about his 2005 book, Strawberry Days, How Internment Destroyed a Japanese American Community. Strawberry Days is a book dear to many of us in the Nikkei community for its deep and human look at a group of Japanese immigrant farmers and their families who, through backbreaking labor, built the foundation for what would become an invaluable real estate area. The book clearly discusses how the increasing success of the Japanese was met with anti-Japanese sentiment and agitation, which eventually destroyed the community. I read this book very closely in creating artwork that honors the Bellevue Nikkei farmers, and I'm indebted to Dave's scholarship. Please feel free to type your questions into the chat at any time during this broadcast, and we'll get to as many of them as we can at the end of the presentation. And now I introduce to you David Neiwert.
Thank you so much, Erin. And before I launch into this, I would just like to say that it's always been a true honor and privilege to be the person telling this story. I kind of stumbled into it, and the people whose story I told, I feel have a great amount of feeling for. Most of them have passed on, but I've always felt it was important to pass on their legacy and to tell their story. So without any further ado, I'm just going to switch over to my share screen. Is everybody seeing the book cover? Great. Okay, so this is the cover of Strawberry Days. It was published in 2005, and it really was the product of a long labor of love that began with a newspaper series that I published at the Journal American in 1992. This was the photo that ran with that, the lead off in that series. And this is a photo of Tom Matsuoka, who was in many ways really one of the leading figures of the pre-war Japanese American community in Bellevue, whose story I was interested in telling, and who I hope to tell here today. So most of these folks were farmers, and these immigrant farmers actually began appearing in the Bellevue area in the late 1890s, early 1900s, and by 1910 or so had the beginnings of a real community. All of them had come to the United States to work on railroad lines. And they'd been recruited by the railroad companies off of farms in mostly southern Japan because the railroad companies thought that they would make better laborers. These laborers were meant to replace the Chinese laborers who had already disappeared. or been excluded with the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1872. These were rough and ready men, and when they were done doing their railroad work, a lot of them went to work for lumber mills. That would include Tom Matsuoka, whose father was working in one of these mills when Tom arrived in the United States in 1915. And these were these were very hardy guys, but they also, a lot of them were actually, the reason Tom was recruited there was that he was a baseball player. One of the things that was very common in Japan was baseball, because in fact the Japanese culture had adopted baseball as a sort of semi-national sport dating back in the 1870s. And so these timber mills, which all had Japanese laborers, would form these baseball teams and they would compete each other. And Tom was actually hired by his timber mill to because of his skills as a baseball catcher. But most of the people that came over and did this, got off the railroad lines, went into farming. And farming involved clearing the land. In the case of Bellevue, we're talking about large tracts of stump lands with old growth stumps in them. These were removed with horses and mattocks and dynamite, and it was very rugged labor. Generally speaking, most of these farmers worked out a deal, a lease arrangement with the white landowners, where they would lease these acreages, typically 5 to 10 acres large, and then once they had cleared the land, they were permitted to use it as their farm for the next 6 or 7 years. And then once this was all, it was cleared out, they would typically move on to another tract and start all over again. But these were called truck farms, these small acreage farms. They grew everything from lettuce to peas to all kinds of produce. But far and away, their biggest crop was, in Bellevue particularly, was strawberries, because that was, they were short-lived, but they made tons of money from selling them because they were enormously popular. So Japanese crews would come over frequently from Seattle and work as laborers on these Japanese farms during the strawberry harvest season. And you can see here, this is a view of Medina looking down to Lake Washington. This is one of the acreages there. And this was how Bellevue gradually became, and the east side became habitable, because these farmers would rip out the old growth and make it a place that you could actually have a farm and a home and raise a family. This was one of the larger tracts of Japanese farms. It was called Mid Lakes, and it was located roughly where you find the Safeway warehouse now. This is another view of that tract. There were about 10 Japanese families working that tract. And all of them, like all of the others in the Bellevue community, tried to have normal lives. You can see here they even would dress up for family portraits, even though these folks were actually poor farmers. This is Frank Suguro and his wife, and they had a very active family. This is their children, or at least, the 5 daughters that they had. They also had a young son named Ed, who was, I believe, the youngest of the clan. He wound up being one of my main sources. This is a lovely young woman named Mitzi Shiraishi, whose family had a strawberry farm up in the Factoria area. And all of these folks, the young people in particular, tried to fit in as Americans. And one of the things they did, of course, was play sports. This was the Bellevue High basketball team, or at least not Bellevue High, but this is rather the community basketball team, with all Japanese girls who shocked their Issei parents by wearing rayon stockings while they played basketball. This team, by the way, was coached by Kaz Matsuoka. Here's a portrait of the Bellevue High School, I believe, class of 1926, or no, I'm sorry, 36. And this is another portrait of the school at Medina. And you can see that there were fully half of these kids were Japanese. And that was pretty much the face of early Bellevue. This is the opening of the Japanese school, where actually Issei parents would send their kids to learn Japanese because they couldn't speak English very well. So it was a big opening. And if you look at the portrait, this photo, you'll see lots of the white neighbors mixed in there, welcoming the opening of this school with their Japanese neighbors. Some neighbors were not so welcoming, though. This was Miller Freeman. He was the commander of the naval militia and a prominent Republican politician who had, in fact, become one of the most powerful men in Washington state beginning in 1908. A lot of the reason he was powerful was that he had amassed an enormous amount of wealth as the publisher of this magazine, Pacific Fisherman. He had started it in Anacortes, moved his operation to Seattle, and the magazine sold in the hundreds of thousands, and it was the basis of a whole slate of trade magazines that Freeman was the publisher of, and they made him a very wealthy man. He lived in Seattle up until the mid-20s, and then that was when he moved to the east side, built himself a mansion, and began transforming Bellevue. Miller Freeman, beginning in 1908, began promoting on the pages of his magazines a very popular theory called the Yellow Peril, which believed that the Japanese emperor had designs on destroying her. It's in fact enslaving the world under his rule. And there was the belief that actually the farmers, the Japanese farmers who were showing up, were actually secretly foot soldiers of the emperor, who, upon given a secret signal from the emperor, would turn upon their white neighbors and commit acts of sabotage and aid whatever invasion was to come. They even envisioned this. There was a book written published in 1909 called The Valor of Ignorance that actually laid out where the invasion was going to happen. This man believed that it was going to happen at Grays Harbor County in Washington state. Anyway, this is a very popular conspiracy theory and was widely believed by literally millions of people, and was promoted in all the newspapers on the West Coast, particularly the Hearst Press. It all reached a culmination in 1919 when Freeman, who was had been appointed secretary of the commission to looking into helping returning veterans from World War I find work, promptly announced after a few years that in fact the main reason that veterans couldn't find work was those Japanese farmers, and the best thing you could do is to deport them. So yes, and if there was any question that this was a white supremacist enterprise, I don't think you had to read very far to reach this conclusion. What they particularly saw as a threat were those women who were marrying those immigrants who had come earlier, and were going to be breeding lots and lots of Japanese children. And this is why they thought eventually the West Coast would be, as they called it, Japanized. And it was, your basic eugenics argument, and it was very popular. There were all kinds of best-selling books that supported these claims. And it even appeared in the, his political campaigns. This is a California senator who talked about, as you can see, the silent invasion. This should be very familiar language to anybody who has been listening to our current immigration debate. And then there was this gentleman. He was the publisher of the newspaper in Aberdeen, Hoquiam. His name is Albert Johnson, and he was a friend of Miller Freeman's. In fact, he was mentored in many regards by Miller Freeman politically. And he was also the congressman from Aberdeen, Hoquiam. You can see he dressed up nicely. And he was appointed to the, he eventually became chairman of the Committee on Immigration. And in that position, he began pushing a straight line, hardcore anti-Japanese immigration platform that would called for not just alien land laws that would prevent aliens ineligible for citizenship from owning land, but also would eventually deport them. And there was this ongoing debate about whether or not the Japanese would just overtake white people on the West Coast. It became eventually the 1924 Immigration Act, also known as the Asian Exclusion Act, which ended all immigration from Japan. And meant that everybody who was already in the United States was, grandfathered in, but none of the Issei were permitted to become citizens because that was not legal either. Only their Nisei children who were born in the United States were in fact considered citizens. And the immigration bill set racial quotas. These racial quotas were considered a huge insult to the Japanese because, of course, the Japanese and Chinese and everyone else from Asia was given zeros on their racial quotas. And there were actually riots in Tokyo. And it actually is believed that the passage of that law is believed to be responsible for or have played a major role in the failure of the democracy movement in Japan that was happening at the time, and the ascension of the militarists who took control of the country at that time and eventually took the nation to war in 1941. In the meantime, in Bellevue, things were moving along. Strawberries were extremely popular. There was an annual festival called the Strawberry Festival, and it was a big event. There were people who would come over on the ferry from Seattle in large crowds, thousands of people, and spend their days in Bellevue and then take the ferry back. It was a big thing in the Seattle press, and there were actually strawberry queens. There was a beauty pageant around the Strawberry Festival. Interestingly, none of these strawberry queens or the contestants were ever anything but Caucasian. That didn't really matter because things were prospering. The farmers are really starting to prosper. This is a photo of Tom Matsuoka taken in 1935 with his son's tie and hats outside the Bellevue Vegetable Growers Association warehouse. I believe this warehouse is still standing just north of of Main Street, next to the railroad tracks there in Bellevue. This is where the Japanese farmers would bring all their produce and ship it out on rail cars to the rest of the country, because they were no longer just having to take their trucks to Seattle. Their produce was selling so well that they were able to ship it to places like Minneapolis and Chicago. And this was one of the labels that they used. And then, but of course, it's important to know that even though the Bellevue Japanese were prospering, there is definitely another vision of Bellevue coming down the road. This is a map that Miller Freeman had drawn up in the mid-1930s, that he basically his vision for what they could do to make Bellevue a place that people could drive to from Seattle. And in fact, he went to work on making this map a reality. He became one of the chief sponsors and promoters of the Homer Hadley Floating Island Bridge that crossed Mercer Island. It opened in 1940 to great fanfare, and suddenly Bellevue was no longer the most distant place driving-wise on the lake from Seattle, but was now the closest. This meant that all those farms were suddenly very valuable properties for anybody, for any land developer who wanted to develop this new mode of living called the suburb. Problem was what to do with those Japanese farmers. Well, on December 7th, 1941, the opportunity came. One of the first things that happened, of course, was that Miller Freeman was proclaimed a prophet and a wizard for having bashed the Japanese for the previous 35 years. And people fell in line to listen to him. One of the first things he insisted on was that the Japanese were likely to be engaging in sabotage, and the local press pitched in on this. There were a lot of hysterical stories run in the press that had absolutely no basis in reality, as well as the usual bits of bigotry shown in cartoons and in newspaper ads, as well as newspaper stories telling people that their Japanese neighbors were going to be committing sabotage. And they had congressional hearings on this, one of them in Seattle, and Miller Freeman, of course, was the lead speaker at that hearing because he was of course, president of the Anti-Japanese League of Washington, and his solution was to deport all of them. Now, by this time, in fact, even before the hearing, FDR had already signed into law Executive Order 9066, which basically paved the way and made it possible for the U.S. Army to declare any group of persons excluded from a military area. And this gave the people at the Western Command in San Francisco the opportunity to do what Lieutenant General DeWitt, the leader of that command, had always wanted to do, which was ship out the Japanese. So the first place they went to, in fact, was Bainbridge Island. And Bainbridge was more or less their test case. And so in April, they deported the entire Japanese population of Bainbridge Island, shipped them off to Manzanar down in Southern California, and it was very successful. So within a matter of weeks, evacuation notices went up in Seattle and in Bellevue. In Bellevue, in mid-May, by May 20th, everyone had been evacuated. These folks all got into a train. There were about and headed to Pinedale, California, which is outside of Fresno. That was their first destination. Most of them then were transferred to the so-called relocation center in Tule Lake, California. Many of those within the first year or so were given the opportunity to transfer to other camps, and most of them transferred to the camp at Minidoka, which is what we see here, because most of them had very close ties to the Seattle community, and that was where the Seattle community was sent, unlike Tule Lake. Some people got out, though. Tom Matsuoka was one of the people who decided he didn't want his family in the camps. He organized this group of laborers to get out by going to work as sugar beet laborers in northern Montana. This was near the town of Chinook. That's Tom leaning back on the fender there. And here's Kaz Matsuoka doing the laundry or some kind of cleaning outside their place there in Chinook. It was a rough life, but they were happy not being in the camps. And there were also other ways of getting out of the camps, and one of them was to join the army. And as you know, this was a very controversial option because it created division within the camps. But a lot of men did sign up for the 442 and soon found themselves in Europe. The man on the left here is Kim Matsumoto. He was the longtime owner of Bellevue Nursery. Here he is as well. Somewhere he's hiding somewhere in that crowd, arriving in Italy. And actually, this is just a shot I got from the Densho folks showing the 442 rounding up some very young German soldiers My understanding is that the Germans were very perplexed to be finding themselves in combat with Japanese soldiers, but there they were. These are some of the folks who were in the 442 from Bellevue. This is Kiyo Yobuki. Kiyo was a longtime postman there on the east side. And here's Kim Matsumoto. And the man on the left is, sorry, the man on the right is Masinatsu, and the man on the left is, oh, and I'm brain cramping right now, another gentleman. They came back when the camp started emptying. Unfortunately, there was actually a campaign to keep them from returning. This is the mayor of Kent pointing out, or sort of leading that campaign. This photo was actually published in Time magazine, and there were the usual kind of leading expressions of bigotry and peculiar, in very peculiar places. There was a campaign actually led by this gentleman who is from Bainbridge Island that spread to Bellevue, and there was actually a public meeting in Bellevue involving this faction, in which people advocated that the Japanese farmers should be prevented from returning to their lands. They were met with a chorus of boos and were heckled out of Bellevue by the people who were their neighbors. In the meantime, life moved on after the camps closed. Here's Miller Freeman paying the final toll on the Mercer Island Bridge in 1947 because he was recognized as being the man who got that bridge built. Tom Matsuoka tried to come back to Bellevue and found that his house had been burned down. So he wound up moving to Montana, back to Montana, buying a farm there in Chinook, where he remained for most of his years, was Montana Farmer of the Year in 1963, and then finally retired to this little house in Ridgefield to be near his daughter, Ray Takakawa, who was living in Vancouver. He died in 1999, and I'm sorry, oops, let's go back. This gentleman, the man on the left, was Joe Matsuzawa. He was an invaluable source to me. And the man on the right was Akira Aramaki, who gave me some of the liveliest interviews that I had. Mitzi Shiraishi on the left and To Kirataka on the right were both. These are all wonderful folks. This is Ray Takakawa, Tom Matsuoka's daughter, who was invaluable in helping me make this happen. Ray passed away shortly after her father died. And this is her brother, Ty, who actually still lives in Bellevue and I believe is still prospering. The man on the left is Ed Suguro. The man on the right is Toshi Ito. This is Al Yabuki on the left and Rose Matsushita. And Mitzi, this is Mitzi Matsushita. And then finally, John Matsuoka, who is Tom's brother and was actually still farming that final little spot of farm around Phantom Lake that was the last vestige of the old farms in Bellevue that you could find. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Dave. That was great. I love seeing all the photos of the Nikkei farmers, sort of in the years that you interviewed them. Very appreciative of your work. I'm going to ask you a question first, and then I think we are getting a couple in the chat. I think this is right. So Strawberry Days came from a series of articles, of award-winning articles that you wrote first. And I just wondered how you first came across the subject at all. I just wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about that.
Sure. Well, I grew up in southern Idaho. My parents were from Twin Falls, and when I was a kid, I used to go. We used to go pheasant hunting at the site of the Minidoka camp. So my dad would put me to work as the bird dog, and he'd run me through the ditches. But this was in the early '60s, and by then everything was gone, except of course the old lava rock chimney from the administration building was still standing. And So, but I remembered it. And then when I moved to Kent in 1989 and went to the White River Historical Museum. When I did and saw the photos displayed there of the camp at Minidoka, and this, set off all kinds of memories for me. And I realized that, hey, this is, we're coming up on the 50th anniversary of this event, and it would be a great little history project for the paper to do. So I went about organizing the interviews and trying to get that started, and then they transferred me up to Bellevue because the same owners own the same paper, or both the Kent and Bellevue papers. And so I was working as the news editor at the Bellevue paper and still doing the same project. And I started to realize, well, actually the Bellevue story was, it was a smaller community than the one in Kent and in the White River area, but the story was a little more interesting, mainly because of the presence of Miller Freeman, quite frankly. And as well as, the attempts to keep them from coming back. But also, how Bellevue really became the epitome of, in many ways, what really happened in the run-up to the internment was that there was this there was a huge amount of pressure from land developers to they were some of the leading people testifying and pushing for the so-called evacuation, because all up and down the coast, all these marginal lands, this was true in Gardena, California. This is true in a lot of the suburbs around Sacramento and San Francisco and Portland, as well as Seattle, that these lands had suddenly been transformed from previously marginal lands, barely usable for their white landowners, and instead had become very valuable properties that were perfectly primed to be developed into residential neighborhoods. And that was what happened. That was the birth of the suburbs. So,
thank you. Yeah. Let's see. I think we have a question from Simon. There it is. What happened to Gail Barge, who defaced an artist statement that's "I'm the artist" at Bellevue College, eliminating words critical of Miller Freeman? Does her action reflect lingering anti-Japanese sentiment in the area? Dr. Barge was placed on administrative leave quite quickly, and then she was let go. And the president of Bellevue College was also let go. So there was swift action that took place on that campus. As for the second part of your question, Simon, I mean, no, I don't think it reflects directly the same kind of direct anti-Japanese sentiment that Miller Freeman was feeling. You probably agree with this, right, Dave? But I think it reflects the white supremacy that's baked into the society there. And it's not just there, but everywhere, right?
Well, yeah, I think it doesn't, I don't think it's anti-Japanese sentiment so much as it's the sort of reflexive defense of the system of white supremacy. I mean, it's one of the things that I learned when I was working for the SPLC was that trying to explain to people what institutionalized white supremacy looks like is actually really hard. It's kind of, it seems like kind of a vague concept, and it's hidden it was woven into the tapestry so thoroughly that it's kind of hard to see. And to me, the story of Miller Freeman is the epitome of institutionalized white supremacy. That was how it worked, was that these founding fathers, these leading fathers, they were the guys that were setting up essentially fundamentally a racial cartel. Mm-hmm. And once that you have that racial cartel built, then there's just all kinds of, it becomes the power structure. And then people always, from all races, because they're in sort of the position where frequently they have to defend that power structure if they have themselves succeeded within it at all. So, and so this was, to me, definitely a very reflective sort of, oh, we got to protect our founding fathers sort of thing, right? Let's not take down that Confederate monument.
Right. Yeah, and I also thought it was interesting in the case of Bellevue College that, this administrator went to these lengths to literally white out facts about Miller Freeman, when the Freeman family seems to have only donated a few $1,000s in the last 5 years. Maybe, I think it's $7,000 or something. So it's more than the exact dollar amount, as Dave was saying. Do we have any other questions, folks out there? Pop another one. You mentioned that a warehouse might still be standing. Are there other buildings in Bellevue from the community that are still there? Yeah, that warehouse is still there. And I believe that a memorial to the Japanese American farmers is in the works. It's been in the works for a few years, several years, a lot of community involvement, including Ed Seguro and the Itos, a lot of the ancestors.
Yeah.
And I don't exactly know what the state is. I don't think there are many other buildings still standing.
Yeah, I don't, I know that like Tokirataka's whole farm was, replaced by those car lots that stand where that farm was.
Mm-hmm.
And the Peterson Hill tract, which had a lot of Japanese farms on it, is the Bellevue Country Club now. And the and obviously Mid Lakes is all that it's either the warehouse. Well, of course it's bus thing and everything else now, right? That whole zone that was Mid Lakes. So I don't think there are any buildings standing. The old Japanese school burned down in, I think, 1960 or something like that. So it was right across the street, from Bell Square. So what became Bell Square? Yeah.
Do we have any others? Or I can, here's one from Frank. Hi, Frank.
Hi, Frank.
David, when Strawberry Days was published, did you get any pushback from Kemper Freeman Jr., any retaliation against you or the Journal American?
No. I tried to interview Kemper when I did the original series, and he wouldn't talk to me. It was funny because, I was good friends with Monty Enbisk, who was the business writer then, and Monty talked to Kemper all the damn time, but Kemper wouldn't give me the time of day. And no, there was never any retaliation. However, it is my understanding, and this is a story I would like to look into. It's my understanding that the Miller Freeman archives, which were the source of most of my information on Miller Freeman, at the University of Washington, another historian went to those archives in 2009 and tried to find the same documents that I had, and those documents had been removed. So I think that's a potential issue, and because I can't imagine anybody operating an archive and finding that ethical. So so there is that. But no, I never had any retaliation. The only thing I know of is that it was kind of hard to get a book event going in Bellevue for Strawberry Days, but Barnes and Noble did host me over there, mainly because my old friend Pat, who I worked with at Pat Moore, who I worked with at the Journal American, was working at Barnes and Noble at the time, and she arranged the thing. So I didn't have many events in Bellevue, but the book was my best-selling book for a long time, and it was a finalist for the Washington State Book Award. So
Great. Here's the second part from Frank. The Freeman family.
Yeah. And how would I characterize it? Frank, I'm not, I don't spend a lot of time in Bellevue now. I live in Ballard, and actually, I'm living most of the time up in Friday Harbor these days. So I can't say that I have a real finger on that pulse. I will say it's pretty obvious that Kemper remains a dominant economic force in the town because he owns so many of those key properties. And I know that he's a very powerful political force in terms of affecting decisions that affect the entire community, including mass transit. He's been a huge He's been a huge source of the pushback on mass transit at a time that I think people in Bellevue could really use it. And the suspicion has always been, of course, that that he's reflexively going back to the old days when people thought mass transit meant people of color moving into your neighborhood. I don't think that's what's in Kemper's mind, but I think it may be sort of a reflexive thing. I don't know. He loves cars. So me, not so much. I don't love cars. So I certainly don't love traffic jams.
There's another one for you there, Dave.
Oh, it's not actually. So the farm that Bellevue Square itself is built on was owned by a white man who I don't think had ever employed Japanese farmers on it. He bought it from him, and in 1928, I think he bought that property, and he and Kemper Sr. And no, I don't think that, but right across the street in what is Lincoln Square and some of those surrounding properties that I know that he has, a lot of those were Japanese farms. We did publish a little graphic of what we were, as far as we were able to tell, from some of the maps that were there, where some of those farms are located. And they were in the area right around Bell Square, but I don't think Bell Square itself actually was a Japanese farm.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Yeah, maybe we'll publish that graphic on the Tadaima site. I think it's fascinating. I have a question for you. What would you say is the reason that you're so fascinated in uncovering the workings of white supremacy in this country? It seems like it's a pretty big theme for you.
Well, I want to leave the world a better place for my kid. And to me, it's always been obvious. I mean, maybe, I don't know. I started doing this when I was very early in my newspaper career. We had the Aryan Nations move into the area where I was working there in the panhandle of Idaho in the late 70s. I was the editor of the little paper in Sandpoint. And I saw how it affected that community. We just had this huge influx of crime and criminality and bad stuff, hate crimes. It was really toxic. And so to me, it was just common sense that you would start writing about these guys and take them seriously as a subject to cover the extremist right. But I think, people thought I was kind of on a quirky obsession for a long time, but it was just that I've always seen the kind of toxins that they produce within just the white communities. I mean, they're always the most paranoid, suspicious people. They're always spreading false information. They're always eventually breaking down and committing violent crimes. And this is just part of the story with right-wing extremism. This is why I've always tried to cover it. But eventually, of course, if you deal with enough victims of these hate crimes and victims of this system of white supremacy, if you're a human at all, I think you have to, your heart starts to feel something different than what I think. I think there's a lot of white folks who are very defensive about this stuff. And I've always been of the belief that I don't think it's going to heal until we, rip that scab off and get the pus out, and the only way we're going to do that is by looking at it and dealing with it honestly and truthfully, and with humility. I think there's a lot that white folks have done, and I understand myself that I whatever wealth I have is on the backs of people, forefathers who did not always behave honorably, and there isn't anything I can do about that. Not what happened back then. Now I can't go back and fix that, but what I can fix is what's going on now. What I can make a difference in is making things better now, and I think that's actually incumbent on every white person. White supremacy isn't going to go away without white people taking it seriously and getting rid of it. So,
very well said. Thank you.
Yeah.
Let's see. I don't think we have anything else going on in the chat. So unless you have any other final parting words, although I thought that was very powerful final words for our time, Dave. No.
Yeah, well, white supremacy is a white people problem, and we're the ones who got to fix it. I've always felt that. I've always felt it was a little outrageous that most white folks are content to sit back and let the victims, black folks and Jews and everyone else, the victims of this system, suffer the consequences and expect them to try to fix it. And we're the ones who have to fix it. We made it. We gotta take it down. That's the way it goes. So.
Thank you so much. Thanks for your time, Dave. And hopefully the book will come back into print. It's not in print.
Nice.
It's available. It's at all the local libraries. I understand there was a time when it wasn't. Of course, you can buy it for your Kindle. Yeah.
I believe if there are a lot of Kindle sales, because I don't think Palgrave never notified me that it was officially out of print, which means that they reserve the option of putting it back in print if it starts selling well again. So hopefully, maybe the numbers we've seen this past year, thanks to the Bellevue College incident, will actually get it back in print. So.
Yes, indeed.
Great.
All right. Thanks. Well, I look forward to having a coffee with you in person.
Likewise. Yeah.
And thanks, everybody. I think there's another piece of live programming coming on at 6:00 Pacific time. So hopefully you all will stay tuned. Thanks very much.
Bye-bye.